The Korean War. We know what it is. We know what happened. Do we know why it happened? Let's get into that, shall we? As we know, by the 30th of April 1945, the Second World War in Europe had come to a close. Now, by this point, the Allies were starting to come together. They were starting to think, all right, what else do we need to do for Europe? How do we make things go back to the way they were? Or how do we make things better? Now, here's the kicker. 1943 and 1945, we had two conferences. In both of these conferences, you had Winston Churchill, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and Joseph Stalin involved. Now, in 1943 and 1945, highly successful, if I do say so myself. But in the post-war conference that was Potsdam, things did not go all too well for either of these guys. Now, the reason for that being is that Roosevelt unfortunately passed away from, I believe it was polio. Now, Roosevelt had just died from polio. Churchill was replaced by the general elections in Britain and was now succeeded by Clement Attlee, who had a very different stance, almost polar opposite to Churchill's. The only man remaining left behind, Joseph Stalin. Now, things broke down completely. Stalin wanted his own sphere of influence within Europe. Meanwhile, Harry S. Truman, the former vice president, now currently president of the United States, did not want any of that to happen. Rather, he wanted to constrict communism within its areas. But by 1948 to 1949, so 1949 is really where we pick up, to be honest. So 1948, you have Mao Zedong in China. As we all know him by now, he is the father of modern China. He basically gave China the path or the workflow that it is on currently. It is the same blueprint that China is using till this day. Now, Mao Zedong comes in and he's like, I want to invade Korea. And Stalin says no. Now, bear in mind, both of these men are communicating because of the fact that they're both communist. So, Stalin, by this point, wants a warm water port because the port in the north of Russia is frozen for 11 months at a time. It is only open for 1 month, but again, that 1 month is nowhere near enough for the mobilization or the level of mobilizations that Stalin wants at that point. So, he does need a warm water port. And that warm water port only happens to be either China, which now under Mao, is most definitely going to be present for them. So let's talk allegiances. Now, you had the South Koreans and the North Koreans, obviously. But, as we know throughout history, you cannot fight a battle without support. So, here's how it went down. South Korea was backed by the UN and the United States, and further on, the United States allies, which included the UK, Canada, Turkey, Western Germany, and Italy, which sounds surprising, trust me. But it really isn't when you consider the fact that Italy was basically out of the Second World War by 1943 and was fighting and infighting had begun in Italy by 1945. By the end of the war, Italy was effectively part of the Allied force that marched into Berlin and took it. Then you have North Korea, which is backed by China and the Soviet Union. Now, the Soviet Union has further resources coming in from the satellite states that Joseph Stalin had established control over in the years prior to 1951. Now, here's a troop breakup. All told, the Allied strength of the South Korean force, or the capitalist force, was 1.7 million, or 1,780,000. On the North Korean side, or the capitalist side, you had 1,742,000 men on the ground. However, the total does vary according to sources from both sides, as China provided 2,970,000 men, whereas the Soviet Union was only able to provide 72,000 men in support. Now, here are the casualties and losses: 170,927 dead men, and 32,585 men missing. This is only the capitalist side, with a total wounded number of 566,434 men. And this does not seem to include, according to sources I have, there aren't any civilian casualties being counted yet. The North Koreans, however, faced a much, much higher toll: 398,000 to 926,000 dead men, with over 145,000 men missing, with a total wounded number of 686,500 men. The disparity in this case is immense, especially when you consider the conclusion of this war. Total civilian deaths come in to about 2 to 3 million. Now, we must bear in mind that South Korea was the winning side. So, the number of casualties that they face is obviously downplayed a little bit. However, it doesn't seem to be too far from the truth, as South Korea lost 990,968 working men and women and children, whereas North Korea was faced with a much higher toll of 1.55 million men, women, and children dead as a result of this conflict. So you can see in this map the consistent change and gain and loss of territory that is by both North and South Korea, and the UN in support of the South Koreans, for all the way from the beginning of the conflict on the 25th of June 1950 to the end of the conflict in 1953. Now, the entire conflict was consistently up until 1952, which is the point where President Harry S. Truman lost the re-election campaign, and in his place came in General Dwight D. Eisenhower, who was the original war hero for America. Now, you can kind of see a turning point in 1950 when the UN forces reached the port of Incheon, deep behind enemy lines, and then regain South Korea, and then move further in towards North Korea, all the way to the very border of China, which is where China now comes in. So, the second that the UN forces touch the border, China immediately begins a deployment across the Yalu River. And it consistently, then it goes back and forth from there. So, one day the North Koreans are gaining, the other day the UN and South Korea are gaining. And it goes on like this for 2 years. In 1952, when President Eisenhower actually takes over, that is the proverbial turning point of the entire conflict. As we know, that Eisenhower now realized that this conflict needs to come to an end somehow, some way. And to that end, he did whatever he felt was necessary. And in that necessity, he did everything possible. He provided emergency deployments, emergency resources, extra resourcing. He even provided for a sort of... he was more of a strategic person. So where Truman was more of an ideological person, he knew what to do when it came to the ideology. But when it came down to strategy on the ground, that was where Eisenhower really succeeded. And that is why the Korean War was effectively a big win for the UN forces, or rather America. Because as we know, America's never really fought a war on its own terms, or rather on any terms, for the welfare of an entire country, but rather they fought generally for their own. We could call it neocolonialism, because by this point there was really no other motive for America to act other than to maintain their hegemony in the world. So from 1951 to 1953, there was really no real change in the front lines. Um, it was on the 27th of July 1953 that an armistice was signed. All gained territories were given back, except North Korea was forced to go back towards the city of Kaesong and ended up losing the city of Sokcho to South Korea. Now, this was all the footage I was able to compile from various sources on the internet, from sources that I use for my own degree in the subject, which is basically politics and international relations. So, history is a very big concern in my degree. So, I felt that these clips from my VLE, which is the University of London's virtual learning experience, that so they have these clips available. These are clips that they've compiled off of YouTube, or rather professors from the University of London and the London School of Economics social sciences group. They have compiled these videos for people to use to be able to understand the conflict, the state on the ground, what it was like on the field, the conditions that they were in. And just from these files alone, just these videos alone, they explain exactly what sort, or rather, the scale of the mobilization that took place. This was by far the biggest conflict since the end of the Second World War, because it was not only a war for, or rather, a conflict for self determination or autonomy, but rather it was the first escalation between the tensions that had existed since mid 1945 between the USSR and the Soviet. Excuse me, between the USA and the USSR. So throughout the Korean War, Seoul was consistently captured, recaptured, taken away, recaptured. It was this permanent cycle between being given to the North Koreans, taken back by the South Koreans. It kept going on like this until Eisenhower finally came onto the 52 and finally brought conflict. So we know that the Korean War happened. We know what happened. But the question that still remains fairly unanswered when we talk about the Korean War is why. Now, the roots for the Korean War are well before the beginning of the World War itself. Either one, actually. So, the whole reason behind the war lies in 1910. So, when Imperial Japan had control over Korea. So, as the story goes, according to most sources on the internet and most books commercially available, Imperial Japan was responsible for severely diminishing the influence of China over Korea in the First Sino-Japanese War, ushering in a short-lived Korean Empire. 10 years later, after defeating Imperial Russia in the Russo-Japanese War, Japan made the Korean Empire a protectorate, and then annexed it 5 years later with the Japan-Korea Annexation Treaty. And after that, the Korean Empire fell, and Korea was directly ruled by Japan from 1910 to 1945. In 1945, by the end of the Yalta Conference, the plans were put into place to bring the Pacific theater of the war to an end, and that is what happened with the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So, the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki effectively brought in the surrender of Japan, which meant that Japan had to surrender its colonies and every area it controlled to America as well, which included everything south of the 38th parallel. So, in 1945, Korea was divided into two, north and south, along the 38th parallel, with the south being given under the protectorate of the United States. Then in 1945, from 49 to 49, so over a 4-year period, you have the Chinese Civil War. So when the war ended in Japan, the Chinese Civil War resumed between the communists and the nationalists there. So while the communists were struggling in Manchuria, they were supported by the North Korean government with materiel and manpower. So according to Chinese sources, the North Koreans donated 2,000 railway cars worth of supplies, while thousands of Koreans served in the Chinese PLA during the war. North Korea also provided the Chinese communists in Manchuria with a safe refuge for non-combatants and communications with the rest of China. The North Korean contributions to the Chinese Communist victory were not forgotten after the creation of the People's Republic of China in 1949. So, as a token of gratitude, between 50 to 70,000 Korean veterans that served in the PLA were sent back along with their weapons, who later played a significant role in the initial invasion of South Korea. China had promised to support the North Koreans in the event of a war against South Korea. Then, in 1948, there was a communist insurgency in South Korea. So by 1948, a large-scale North Korea-backed insurgency had broken out in South Korea, which was exacerbated by the ongoing undeclared border war between the Koreas, which saw division-level engagements and thousands of deaths on both sides. The ROK in this time was almost entirely trained and focused on counterinsurgency rather than conventional warfare, which means that they were trained to take care of threats after they had happened or happened within the country, rather than starting one or fighting one off while it was happening. Based on empirical evidence alone, we know that the war in Korea really actually happened not just because of one person's need for stability or wanting to unify a peninsula against a common enemy, or rather invite someone for stability in, but rather it was because of Cold War tensions between the USSR and the USA. The USA feared that the Soviets would try and increase their sphere of influence. So, fearing that the balance of power and the hegemony of the USA would be inherently threatened by the Soviet Union was what prompted the need to go into Korea again and then actually participate in what was perhaps the linchpin for the entire Cold War conflict itself. As a result, we can come to the conclusion however astronomical it may sound. Trust me, I am no professor of history. I'm simply a university student who knows about this, who loves talking about this. But it is inherently my opinion that had Korea been unified under Kim Il Sung and allowed to maintain a course towards democracy rather than have two powers force themselves upon the peninsula, split into two, and cause consequences that can still be felt today, that kind of thing is totally unnecessary. And there are no grounds to justify any of that, even if you think that the balance of power may result in a security dilemma for two powers. In the end, that is inconsequential when it comes to the main motive for peace. If you let two countries be or operate the way that they are operating, as they historically have, especially after a major conflict, you are going to see change there no matter what. But the fact that the USA and the USSR decided to jump up and jump at the chance to actually establish their hegemony in this area, in East Asia specifically, is a step that is quite frankly unreasonable and unnecessary, especially after the Second World War. So we know that the war happened. We know that it happened because of the USA's ambitions to maintain the balance of power, to create a democratic world order, to maintain peace. We know that it happened because the Soviets under Stalin wanted to increase their own security in the world. However, this does not justify their actions here. When we look at these numbers with the morality that we have today, the sort of sensibilities that we have today, the schools of thoughts we're exposed to today, these numbers are nothing short of a tragedy. The amount of human lives lost in just this one conflict is immense enough to put even the most normal men into the deepest of depressions possible. So just imagine the sort of emotional trauma that these men and women had to go through making these decisions that ended up with these men and women losing their lives for their country. Even though it's for a good cause, this sort of human cost can never truly be justified, no matter what the end is, or even if it is an end to a means. Something like this can never be justified in history. We have seen this, we have heard this. There is no growing beyond this. The only thing we can do is we can immortalize them. We can remember them for the heroes that they were, the heroes that they will be, and the heroes that they are, and make them examples of good in our history. And ladies and gentlemen, that's it on my video for the Korean War. I hope I was able to explain this as simply as possible, because I understand that this is not everyone's cup of tea. Now, I do want you to know that this is my first time trying out something like this. So if there are any errors, I do sincerely apologize. If there are any sort of mistakes, I will be working on those to get better, because this is something I'm trying out for the very first time in my life. So anyways, thank you. I hope you enjoyed the video. Please like, subscribe, share the video if you want, and I'll see you next time. Bye.